In the glittering heart of Fifth Avenue, chandeliers blaze and violins soar, yet one smile trembles beneath the light. Tonight is the Whitfords' grand anniversary, a kingdom of crystal and champagne, and a secret about to shatter it all. A journalist slips through silk and smoke with a leather folder. A past, carefully buried, rises like a tide. Duty demands a perfect toast. Desire demands the truth. When the glass falls, whose world will break and whose will begin? Before we step into the ballroom, tell me, where are you listening from? And what draws you most to period romances, the forbidden glances, the grand estates, or the heroines who refuse to bow? Your story starts here. New York City, 1896. The snow outside fell in perfect silence, as if the heavens themselves wished not to disturb the glittering illusion that reigned within the Whitford mansion on Fifth Avenue. Every window blazed with golden light, and carriages lined the street like jeweled beetles, their wheels crunching through the frost. Inside, chandeliers dripped with crystals that caught the glow of hundreds of candles, multiplying it into rivers of fire. Music floated through the marble corridors, a lilting Viennese waltz that rose and fell like the breath of an empire at its peak. Ellen Whitford stood at the top of the grand staircase, poised as though carved from porcelain and resolve. She had chosen her gown carefully, deep sapphire silk that caught the lamplight and shimmered with quiet defiance. Pearls adorned her neck and hair, their luster faint beside her composed beauty. At 60, she was the embodiment of grace, a woman who had learned to make silence her weapon. Her eyes, the color of pale honey, surveyed the ballroom where laughter echoed and skirts rustled like restless whispers. "Mrs. Whitford, you look radiant tonight," murmured Mrs. Kensington, one of the city's most notorious social commentators, as she passed. Ellen smiled, the kind of polite, perfect smile that revealed nothing. Behind that smile lived the exhaustion of 21 years of suspicions. Perfume on her husband's coats, the scent of someone younger and more daring, letters that burned in the fireplace before she could read them, the lingering pauses in conversations where truth might have lived. But none of that mattered tonight. Tonight, she had vowed, she would be perfect. Across the ballroom, Charles Whitford, the railroad tycoon, the lion of Fifth Avenue, laughed too loudly, his voice booming over the orchestra. He was a tall man, his once dark hair now streaked with silver, his posture proud though time had carved lines into his face. His reputation gleamed like the gold buttons on his tailcoat. He raised his glass toward the mayor, toward senators, toward those who owed their fortunes to his empire. Ellen watched him and wondered when admiration had turned to pity. The air was heavy with perfumes, violet, rose, ambergris, blending with the scent of champagne and cigar smoke. Waiters glided between guests in white gloves, serving oysters on silver trays. Conversations sparkled, hollow and bright. Laughter fluttered like silk fans. Near the corner, unnoticed, a young man stood with an air of restraint. His attire was plain compared to the spectacle around him. A black lounge suit, neatly pressed, spectacles catching the chandelier's glow. He held a leather notebook close to his chest. The journalist. Ellen did not know him, but his gaze lingered too long on her husband. The orchestra shifted into a Strauss waltz, and couples took to the floor. Ellen descended the staircase with her usual calm, her hand brushing the banister as if touching the surface of a dream. Guests turned to look. Admiration followed her every step. She felt it, the gaze of society upon her like a crown of glass, fragile and cutting. "Ellen," Charles said, meeting her halfway. His tone was smooth, confident, performative. "You look beautiful. Our guests will talk about this evening for decades." "I'm certain they will," she replied softly. Her voice was steady, but her pulse trembled beneath her gloves. He kissed her hand, his lips cool. Around them, photographers prepared their cameras, the flash powder ready to immortalize the illusion of marital harmony. The orchestra swelled once more, and Ellen allowed him to lead her into the dance. As they moved beneath the chandeliers, she felt the world tighten around her. the walls of marble, the eyes of New York's finest, the ghosts of her own restraint. The music rose, her gown flared like a wave of midnight silk, and for a brief aching instant she remembered being 20, when she had danced with Charles for the first time, when love had felt simple and true. But the moment dissolved as quickly as it came. From the edge of the crowd, the journalist slipped a folded paper to another man who vanished into the servants' corridor. A ripple passed through the guests, subtle as a breeze at first. Then came a murmur, quiet, questioning, like the first crack in a mirror. Ellen felt it before she heard it. She turned toward the staircase, where a servant, pale and trembling, handed a newspaper to one of the bankers. The man's face drained of color. Whisper upon whisper began to thread through the music. Ellen glanced toward her husband. Charles's smile faltered. The orchestra continued, unaware that it was now playing the soundtrack to ruin. A senator's wife gasped. The sound sliced through the air, and the violinist stumbled, the melody collapsing into confusion. Guests turned in unison as a hush fell, smothering the music. Scandal, embezzlement, someone whispered. The Whitford accounts, the soprano. Ellen's gloved fingers tightened around her fan. The words hung in the air like smoke. She looked toward the young journalist, who now stood with his head bowed, not triumphant, but solemn, as though even he regretted the truth he had unleashed. Charles's face flushed crimson. "It's a lie!" he barked, his voice echoing against the marble. "Slander!" But it was too late. Every eye in the ballroom turned to him. Ellen felt the weight of 21 years pressed down on her heart. She remembered every unanswered question, every faint scent of betrayal that she had dismissed as imagination. And now, under the golden chandeliers that once symbolized triumph, she saw her life for what it was, a fragile empire built upon deceit. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles stammered, lifting his trembling hand, "this is nonsense, fabricated by enemies of my company." The mayor stepped back. The photographers lowered their cameras. A silence heavier than accusation filled the room. Ellen's breath came slow, deliberate. She had spent years rehearsing poise. Now she summoned every ounce of it. She moved to the stage, where the musicians had fallen still, and reached for the champagne glass meant for her toast. Her hand did not shake. "My husband," she began, her voice carrying with an authority that startled even herself, "has always valued truth above all things." The irony hung like perfume. A few guests averted their eyes. Charles stared at her, pleading silently, his mask cracking. "Let us drink," she continued, "to what is revealed when the light is too bright to lie." The glass slipped from her fingers. It shattered upon the marble floor, the sound clear and final. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The orchestra's silence became sacred. Then came the rush of whispers, the flurry of skirts, the gasps, the empire collapsing in the span of a breath. Ellen turned slowly, her gown brushing against the broken crystal. Her husband stood frozen amid his guests, his empire unraveling in the very hall he had built to glorify himself. She did not cry, she did not scream. She only walked away, past the bankers, past the cameras, past the murmurs that would soon become headlines. Outside, the night was bitter and still. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the city suspended in silence. She lifted her chin to the sky, feeling the cold air sting her cheeks, and for the first time in decades, she breathed without fear. Behind her, through the tall windows of the ballroom, chandeliers still gleamed bright, fragile, and doomed to fall. The morning after the gala arrived with a cruel clarity. A pale winter sun filtered through the tall windows of the Whitford mansion, casting long golden streaks across the parquet floors, as if mocking the shadows that had claimed the night before. Outside, Fifth Avenue was unusually hushed. Carriages still passed, but slower, as though their occupants were unsure whether to look toward the house or pretend it no longer stood. Inside, servants moved quietly, their footsteps softened by years of training, but heavy with unease. Silver trays remained untouched, sconces still burned from the night before. No one had dared put out the lights. The newspapers came early. Folded in half and stacked with surgical precision by the butler, their headlines screamed in inky capitals. Whitford Empire collapsing. Railroad tycoon accused of embezzlement, infidelity. Opera singer named in Whitford scandal. By mid-morning, they were everywhere. On breakfast tables, inside carriages, slipping from the gloves of ladies pretending not to read, clutched in the hands of newsboys shouting on every corner, and still, Ellen had not changed. She stood alone in the small salon overlooking the gardens, the same sapphire gown from the night before clinging to her like a memory she could not yet shed. The lace sleeves were slightly wrinkled. A thread had come loose near the shoulder. Her gloves had been removed, revealing pale, delicate fingers that held a single newspaper like it were a confession. The mirror across the room reflected a woman no longer part of the world outside. She stared at her own image, not with vanity or shock, but with something far more dangerous, awareness. A silent, slow-burning comprehension that nothing, no title, no ballroom, no chandelier, would ever protect her again. She had not slept, nor wept, nor eaten. Charles had not returned. At some point during the night, after the final guest had fled and the servants had extinguished the chandeliers, he had disappeared. The last sight of him had been on the staircase, surrounded by men in cravats and waistcoats who no longer wanted his hand, only his denial. Now the house, once vibrant with activity, laughter, orchestras, breathed only silence. A silence that stretched across carpets, curled up staircases, and hovered in the folds of Ellen's gown, like a veil of ash. A light knock sounded at the door. It was Rose, her lady's maid, hesitant, eyes wide. "There's a caller, madam. Mr. Thomas Whitford. He insists." Ellen's chin lifted slightly. "Let him in." Moments later, her eldest son entered the room with the righteous fury of a man who believed himself entitled to answers. 38, impeccably dressed in a three-piece suit that mirrored his father's taste in its severe lines and polished shoes, Thomas brought with him the smell of tobacco and ink, fresh from the club, no doubt, or from a back room where reputations were salvaged over cigars and threats. "Mother," he said, no greeting, no warmth. "Do you realize what you've done?" Ellen lowered the paper slowly, her eyes cool and unreadable. "I'm not the one who stole money, Thomas. You humiliated father in front of senators, governors, clients. You humiliated me. Your father humiliated himself. I merely refused to lie. He needed your support, not your silence. The papers are painting you as complicit by omission, and I—" He broke off, pacing in front of the fireplace, hands clenched. "Do you understand what this will do to my position on the board, to my investments? My name is Whitford, too." A pause. Ellen stood still, the only movement in the room, the slight trembling of the paper in her hand. "You carry the name," she said quietly, "but I carried the man." Thomas flinched. "You were a child when he began this empire. I stood beside him through every negotiation, every threat, every sleepless night. I watched him charm rooms, and I watched him lie in the same breath. And while you inherited his voice, I inherited his secrets. You could have warned us. I did. I warned you 1,000 times. You called it a woman's paranoia." Thomas's gaze darted to the mirror, as if seeing for the first time the toll of silence on the face of the woman before him. But pride was his father's inheritance, and he would not surrender it. "You should have protected him," he muttered, softer now, with venom buried beneath the hurt. "I spent 21 years doing exactly that," Ellen replied. "I think I've done enough." He left without another word. Alone again, Ellen moved through the house with quiet purpose. In the study, she found the remnants of Charles's deception, not in vaults or safes, but in the little things he believed beneath her notice. An unlocked drawer, a crumpled envelope in the fireplace. She knelt by the hearth, her gloved hand brushing the cold ashes until she found it, half-burned paper bearing a familiar crest. The deed to a building on West 57th. a property Charles had insisted was a business acquisition, but there, in the margins, scribbled in his own hand, was a name she had only heard once before, sung on a stage in a voice too young and too bright. The soprano. He had bought her a home. The heat that rose in Ellen's chest was not rage. It was clarity, a sharpening of vision that made every deception, every late night, every careless word fall into place like the final turn of a lock. By noon, she had gathered 3 boxes filled with letters, receipts, keys and documents Charles had left behind. She moved methodically, dust rising from shelves, her skirts trailing like waves behind her. No servant was called. This was her work now. At one point in the master bedroom, she found one of his overcoats draped over a chair. She pressed it to her face, inhaling not the scent of the man she had once loved, but of lavender perfume, delicate, foreign, not hers. She folded the coat and placed it into a trunk. She would decide later whether to burn it. The afternoon faded into a grey dusk. The candles in the hall had burned down to stubs. Outside, a light snow began to fall again, delicate and relentless. In her private dressing room, Ellen finally returned to the mirror. The gown hung from her shoulders like a ghost. Her hair was still pinned, though strands had fallen around her temples. Her lips were pale. The pearls at her throat felt heavy, as if they belonged to another woman. She stared at herself without blinking. The woman in the reflection was no longer the mistress of a house or the wife of a tycoon. She was something else now, something stripped bare, tempered by humiliation and silence, something forming beneath the ruin. A soft knock, then silence. "Madam?" Rose's voice, muffled, hesitant. "Would you like me to help you change?" Ellen turned slowly. "No," she said at last, voice low, steady. "Not yet." And she remained there, standing in that same gown, as night reclaimed the windows and the city beyond fell once again into whispers. She stood, watching the woman she once was vanish, and the one she would become begin to take shape in the glass. The train to Newport cut through the frozen countryside like a silver thread unraveling from the hem of a once ornate tapestry. As snow fell gently against the windows, Ellen Whitford sat alone in the private compartment that had once carried her to summer galas, regattas, and garden luncheons under striped parasols. Now it carried her into exile, wrapped in a dark wool travelling coat with velvet trim. Her gloved hands rested motionless atop a leather valise. She had packed lightly, the gowns, the jewels, the silks. None had come with her. What remained was silence and necessity. A change of mourning clothes, a writing set, a single photograph of her children taken a decade earlier when they still looked to her with innocent eyes. She had not wept when she left the mansion on Fifth Avenue. She had not turned back. The carriage rocked softly. Outside, bare trees stood like sentinels along the tracks, their branches reaching skyward as though pleading for answers. Ellen's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, but her mind wandered backward, into forgotten corners of memory. The house in Newport awaited her. Whitford House by the sea, once a place of carefree summers and laughter on the cliffs, but over time it had become a relic, neglected as the family's ambitions turned toward cities and titles. It had been years since she last walked through its salt-kissed corridors. By the time the train arrived, daylight was fading into a pink-gold dusk. A light snow dusted the platform, and the briny air of the coast curled around her as she descended, her boots crunching on frost. No servants met her. She had instructed them not to. It was a quiet arrival, deliberate. The carriage that took her from the station was old but sturdy. The driver, a local man with weathered hands, recognized her name but asked no questions. They rode in silence through winding roads lined with stone walls and dormant gardens. When the house finally emerged, perched on a cliff above the Atlantic, its pale facade weathered by wind and time, it took her breath for a moment. Whitford House still stood, modest by Fifth Avenue standards, but dignified. Ivy clung to its eastern wall, and a wooden swing hung motionless from the large oak in the side garden. The windows reflected the last blush of sunlight, and for a moment Ellen felt something like fear, not of the house, but of what she might find inside herself once she crossed its threshold. She unlocked the door herself. The scent of dust and salt greeted her like an old acquaintance. Furniture sat beneath linen covers. The hearth was cold. She lit a lamp and set it on the hallway table. Its glow reached toward the staircase, revealing portraits whose eyes had not aged in her absence. Upstairs, in a smaller bedroom than the one she once shared with Charles, she unpacked her valise and changed into a simple black gown with a high lace collar. The room was quiet, but not unkind. She opened a window. The sea breathed in and out below, its rhythm steady, patient. That night she did not dine. She sat in a cane-backed chair by the fireplace with a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders and a blanket across her knees. The fire she built crackled modestly, more light than warmth. She listened to the wind, and for the first time in weeks she slept without interruption. The days that followed passed like turning pages in a book long forgotten. Ellen rose early, dressed plainly, and walked the cliff path behind the house, her boots pressing into frozen soil. The cold air cleared her lungs, sharpened her thoughts. In town, she visited the grocer in person, choosing her own fruit, speaking to clerks with quiet grace. She was not recognized immediately. That suited her. It was on the third day that she first saw him. Edward Hale stood by the edge of the town square, leaning slightly against a post while speaking to a boy loading crates. He wore a brown wool coat, faded at the cuffs, and a cap pulled low against the cold. His hands were calloused, his stance marked by the slight favoring of one leg. He did not see her at first. She noticed the quiet strength in his bearing, the way he listened more than he spoke. Only when she passed did his eyes lift and meet hers. There was no recognition, just a pause, a flicker. She nodded faintly. He tipped his hat. Nothing more. But the memory of his eyes, steadfast and steady, followed her back up the hill. Later that evening, Ellen opened the secretary desk in the library. Inside was a leather-bound book, its spine creased from long disuse. She drew it out with reverence. Her sketchbook. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with pencil studies of ocean waves, her children's hands, and a series of unfinished portraits, one of herself, begun in youth and never completed. She turned to a blank page and lifted the pencil. Her fingers hesitated, uncertain. Then, slowly, the outline of a garden gate emerged, rusted iron, half open, framed by overgrown wisteria. Her hand trembled only once. Drawing again felt like remembering who she had been before she was Mrs. Whitford. Before social duties, before deception, before silence. There had been a girl who loved texture and shadow, who found peace in ink and solitude. Ellen drew until her eyes blurred with sleep. The next morning, she returned to town to visit the stationer. As she exited the shop, her path crossed with Edward's once more. "You've been away a long time," he said, his voice deep but gentle. Ellen turned. "Yes, the house needed someone to open the windows." He studied her for a moment. "It suits you better than the city." She tilted her head. "You know who I am." "I worked for your husband once," he said simply. "I know who you were then. I don't presume to know who you are now." There was no bitterness in his tone, only a kind of honesty that startled her. She had grown so used to polished lies, to veiled glances. Edward's gaze held no performance. She considered him, the set of his jaw, the faint silver threading his temple. "And who are you now, Mr. Hale?" "A man with nothing left to lose," he answered, "which makes me very free." Ellen's breath caught, only for an instant. She offered a small smile, one not born of habit, but of acknowledgement. "Freedom can be dangerous," she said. "So can silence." They parted without further words, but as she walked away, her hand pressed lightly against her coat where her heart beat faster than before. That evening, Ellen sketched again. This time, she did not draw a place. She drew a man. Broad shoulders, strong hands, eyes that saw too much but judged nothing. The sketch was quick, unfinished. She did not name him. Days passed. She returned to town often. Sometimes she saw Edward, sometimes she did not. But when their paths did cross, there was always a quiet exchange, of words, of glances, of something deeper neither dared name. Not yet. In the solitude of Whitford House, Ellen read, wrote and painted. Her letters remained unanswered. Her children did not write. The scandal in New York had grown louder, but she had grown quieter, stronger. One night she lit a single candle in the library and stood before her reflection in the tall glass cabinet door. No pearls, no corset, no pretense. Just a woman in a soft black gown, with ink on her fingers and wind in her hair. She did not miss the mansion. She did not miss the gala nights or the gossip or the marble staircase she had once descended with feigned dignity. What she missed, what stirred now, was truth. And in that truth, in that silence filled with pencils and sea air and honest glances, something new was being born, something fragile but real, and she would not turn away from it. The wind off the Atlantic had changed. What once blew cold and bracing now carried the early promise of thaw, mingled with salt and the scent of wet earth. The coastal trees, still bare, shivered faintly in the morning light, and the sea no longer crashed with rage, but murmured with something slower. Resignation, perhaps, or caution. Ellen Whitford stood at the window of her library in Newport, a cup of tea cooling in her hand, her thoughts far from the garden below. The fire behind her crackled gently, casting light across the polished mahogany floor and the heap of letters that sat unopened on her desk. The week's correspondence had arrived at once. Most she had come to ignore. Threats veiled as condolences, invitations offered out of morbid curiosity, and notes from society women who once fought for her attention, but now wrote with claws, dipped in honey. But among the pile lay a single envelope addressed in a familiar hand. Slanted, elegant, a daughter's hand. Ellen set down the cup with care and reached for it. Her breath slowed. Margaret. She broke the seal with a trembling finger and unfolded the pale blue paper. Dearest mother, I have waited to write until I could write without fear. You must know that I do not believe what they say. You stood in front of the world that night and did not hide, and that told me all I needed. I have asked Father nothing. I no longer ask him anything. I only ask that you allow me to tell you that I admire you more now than I ever did before. Your daughter always, Margaret. The words pressed against her chest like a balm she did not know she needed. She closed her eyes and let the silence stretch, absorbing the rare warmth of something sincere. The past had stolen many things, but this letter, this fragile strand of affection, was a thread she might hold on to. Later that day, Ellen made her way into town, her presence no longer the spectacle it had once been. She wore a simple walking dress of slate-grey wool with a cream collar and gloves of soft kid leather. Her hair was pulled back in a modest chignon, silver glinting in the sunlight like threads of frost. Heads still turned as she passed, but they no longer whispered. They watched. At the stationer's shop, she lingered longer than usual, selecting fresh ink and thick parchment. She exchanged polite words with the shopkeeper, then paused by the window where a stack of local newspapers caught her attention. One headline, modest and nestled in the corner, bore her name, not as scandal, but as symbol. The Lady Who Stood Still. She purchased the paper and returned home, unfolding it with cautious curiosity. There, beneath the headline, an op-ed unfolded. It was unsigned, written with restrained eloquence. The writer spoke not of Charles's crimes, nor of the scandal's weight, but of Ellen's composure. Her silence, it claimed, had roared louder than any accusation. Her glass had shattered, but she had not. She read it twice, then a third time. The author was anonymous, but she felt it in her bones. The careful cadence, the respect in the phrasing, the journalist, the one who had ended her marriage with a whisper and a pen. He was watching still, and he, too, had seen something worth writing. That evening she shared the paper with Edward Hale. They had begun to meet in small, unspoken rhythms. A brief conversation in town, a walk along the coastal path, a quiet exchange of glances across the churchyard. He had come to Whitford House that afternoon under the pretense of delivering a parcel, a rolled blueprint she had not asked for, but he claimed was useful. She invited him to tea. In the drawing room, where the furniture still wore dust but the fire had been freshly lit, they sat on opposite chairs. The newspaper lay between them, folded to the op-ed. He read in silence. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. "You're becoming a symbol." "I didn't ask to be," she said gently. "No," he agreed, "but you didn't refuse it either." Their eyes held. There was no smile, but the air between them warmed subtly, like the fire behind the grate. Theirs was a companionship born not of flirtation, but of quiet recognition, a shared understanding of being wounded by the same hand and surviving in separate silences. "Charles mortgaged part of the Newport property," she said softly, turning to the documents on the table, "under a false name, to purchase an apartment in the city. For her." Edward nodded once, unsurprised. "I suspected as much. One of the deeds passed through a name I recognized, a shell company. I was asked to sign off on it years ago. When I refused, I was dismissed." She studied him. "And yet you still work with your hands. You didn't leave." "I thought about it," he admitted. "But then I thought, if I left, he would have erased me entirely. I'd rather live in shadows than disappear." Ellen's gaze dropped to the teacup in her hand. "I disappeared anyway," she said. "No," he said, his voice firmer now. "You were hidden, not gone." A silence fell. It was not heavy. It was reverent. She reached into the stack of papers and withdrew a receipt. "These are the jewels he bought her, from the same merchant who once handled our anniversary gifts." Edward looked down at the list. Diamonds, rubies, a brooch shaped like a crescent moon. Ellen's fingers brushed the edge of the receipt as if it might burn her. "He bought her the moon," she murmured. "He sold the ground beneath your feet to do it," Edward replied. Their eyes met again. That night when Edward left, he paused at the threshold. "You shouldn't carry this alone," he said quietly. "I've carried worse," she replied. "Maybe," he said, "but now you don't have to." She said nothing, but her eyes followed him until he vanished into the misty path beyond the hedges. Later, alone in the library, Ellen returned to her sketchbook. She opened to a blank page and began to draw, not the house, nor the cliffs, nor the sea, but a hand reaching for another, almost touching but not quite. A breath between them, tension without release. In the distance, waves crashed. The fire hissed in the hearth. She dipped her pen again. The ink flowed smoothly. Letters and lies had defined her past. But now, between the lines, something new was beginning to form, and she would not look away. Newport, once a place of rest, had begun to pulse again, not with the frivolity of its social summers, but with a quieter rhythm, steadier and stronger. Beneath the salt-heavy air and the dormant hedgerows, something subtle had begun to grow. Ellen Whitford walked its streets not as a recluse, nor as a widow in mourning, but as a woman returning to life. Not a life she had once known, but a new one, drawn carefully from the ashes of the old. Her days were no longer dictated by invitations or appearances. Now they were shaped by conversations behind closed doors, discreet letters passed in sealed envelopes, and meetings that began with skepticism and ended in silence, pregnant with reconsideration. She had become a woman of interest again, but for reasons no one had foreseen. At precisely 10:30 on a Friday morning, Ellen entered the private parlour of the Belmont Hotel. The room smelled faintly of pipe smoke and beeswax, with velvet drapes drawn against the winter light and a silver tea service resting untouched at the far end of the polished table. 3 men sat waiting, quiet, composed and visibly uncertain of what to expect from the woman who had for years been no more than the decorative figure at Charles Whitford's side. She wore a walking suit in charcoal wool, the jacket modestly cinched at the waist, and the skirt falling in crisp pleats. A mourning brooch glinted at her collar, and her gloves, black suede, finely stitched, remained on as she approached the table. "Gentlemen," she greeted with grace, her voice low and composed, "thank you for receiving me." They stood, offered brief nods, and gestured toward the open seat. One of them, Mr. Garvey, an older man with thinning white hair and eyes like polished glass, studied her with a hint of familiarity. He had known Charles, had once dined in their home. He remembered Ellen as a shadow at the edge of the table, always smiling, always silent. But today she did not smile. She unfolded a set of papers from her satchel and laid them before them. Documents she had uncovered herself, ledgers she had organized, plans that bore not her husband's signature but her own. "I believe you are already familiar with the properties along the Eastern Track," she began, pointing gently to the map. "But what you may not know is that Charles diverted company funds, your funds, to secure personal investments. I have the records to prove it." Mr. Garvey's brows lifted. "And why bring this to us, Mrs. Whitford?" "Because I'm no longer willing to pretend I didn't see what I saw," she said plainly, "and because you're in a position to do something about it." Another gentleman shifted uncomfortably. "It's highly irregular, a woman." "Yes," she said, interrupting softly. "It is. But then again, so was hiding embezzlement behind a soprano's perfume." The men exchanged glances. Garvey cleared his throat. "Your composure is impressive." "It's earned," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "And it isn't new. You simply never noticed it before." He leaned back slightly, then nodded. "Mrs. Whitford, I think it's time we did." After the meeting, she stepped out into the weak afternoon sun, her heart beating with a strange calm. She had not convinced them all, but she had not been dismissed either. She had spoken not as a widow, but as a strategist, a woman with facts, a woman with will. Waiting by the iron gate was Edward Hale. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his coat, hat tilted against the wind, his eyes steady on her approach. He had not asked to accompany her. He simply appeared when needed, never intrusive, never distant. "Well," he asked, as they began walking side by side. "They listened," she said. "For once, they listened." "You were the one speaking," he said. "That's why." She glanced sideways at him. There was no flattery in his tone, only quiet certainty. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. They walked in silence through the cobbled streets, past shuttered shops and the lingering scent of roasting chestnuts. Newport was quieter in winter, stripped of its excess, its intimacy laid bare, a place of raw truths, like the ones now living between them. At the edge of the park, beneath a bare elm tree, Edward paused. "I almost left," he said abruptly. Ellen turned. "Left where?" "America," he replied. "After Charles dismissed me, I had nothing, no references, no prospects. He blackened my name in every company that mattered. There was a ship bound for Lisbon. I stood at the docks for 2 hours. Why didn't you board?" He looked at her, the grey of his eyes catching a sliver of late sunlight. "Because I didn't want to disappear. Not without someone knowing the truth." Her breath caught. The words were simple, but they landed deep. She nodded slowly, understanding without needing to speak. He looked away then, to the horizon where the sea met the sky in a seamless blur. "You were always at those dinners. Quiet, gracious. I thought—" He stopped himself, then continued with care. "I thought you didn't see anything." "I saw everything," she said, barely above a whisper. Their eyes met again. It was not love, not yet, but something older, weightier, a recognition, a mutual knowing of pain and of the dignity that comes from bearing it without surrender. That night, back at Whitford House, Ellen entered her bedroom as the last light vanished from the windows. She lit a single lamp and crossed to the dressing table, where her jewelry box lay untouched. She opened it slowly. Inside, nestled among pearl combs and unused earrings, rested her wedding ring. She stared at it. It was gold, simple, no longer gleaming. A band that had once symbolized union, then duty, then silence. She reached for a small velvet box, navy blue, worn at the edges, and opened it. Gently she placed the ring inside. Her hands did not tremble. She closed the box, and with it closed the last chapter of illusion, not with bitterness, not with rage, but with the quiet triumph of a woman who had learned to see clearly and had chosen, at last, to be seen. Spring crept cautiously into Newport, not with the lush bloom of gardens or the rapture of songbirds, but with a softness in the wind, a quiet lifting of the grey that had hung for so long over the sea. The magnolias in the southern orchards had not yet blossomed, but their buds were heavy with promise. Ellen watched them often, from the window of the upstairs drawing-room, a cup of black tea untouched at her side, her thoughts clouded with something far more turbulent than weather. In New York, the storm had broken. The soprano, Miss Viola Devereaux, had emerged from the shadows with all the flair of a stage star who had waited too long in the wings. Her face now adorned every society page. Her name, once whispered in scandal, now danced from the lips of critics and benefactors alike. She did not deny her connection to Charles Whitford. Instead, she gilded it with tragedy, with devotion, with art. She appeared at a charity concert wrapped in furs, descending the marble steps of the Metropolitan Opera in a gown of emerald velvet and diamonds, unmistakably Whitford in provenance. Reporters followed her with fervour, noting every flutter of her fan, every tear dropped during a well-timed aria. And when asked about the accusations, she replied with tragic poise, "Love does not recognize legalities. I was never his mistress. I was his salvation." Ellen read the article once, then again, and finally, without comment, folded the newspaper and tucked it into the drawer beside her desk. She had learned that fame, like perfume, clung most to those who applied it with abandon. But Charles was not content to let the narrative slip from his control. Through a well-known law firm, he prepared to file a case for slander against the journalist, against the board members who distanced themselves, and perhaps most bitterly, against Ellen herself. The summons came on a rainy Wednesday. A formal request for her appearance in court to address allegations of defamation and breach of marital confidence. The language was cold. The intent was not. This was not about law. This was about humiliation. Ellen sat with the letter in her hands, the rain tapping softly against the parlour windows. Across from her, Edward stood near the hearth, a log in his hand, unmoving. "He's desperate," he said quietly. "Yes," Ellen replied, "and dangerous. You don't have to do this." She looked at him, her eyes steady. "Yes, I do." She travelled to the city 2 days later, arriving under a sky the colour of tarnished pewter. Her carriage rolled through the familiar streets of Manhattan, past theatres and counting-houses, past shopgirls whispering on stoops, and gentlemen lifting their hats with practised courtesy. But none of it touched her. At the courthouse steps, a small crowd had gathered. Reporters with ink-stained hands. Curious onlookers with umbrellas tilted against the drizzle. A few society women clad in fine silks, their interest sharpened not by loyalty but by spectacle. Ellen descended slowly, her morning gown pressed and unadorned, her gloves immaculate. She wore no jewels, no veil, only a hat with a narrow brim and a ribbon of black satin tied beneath her chin. She walked past the whispers, the scribbling pens, the low clicks of cameras. She did not bow her head. Inside, the courtroom was warm, too warm, the air thick with perfume and anticipation. Charles sat at the front, surrounded by attorneys. His expression was neutral, but his eyes betrayed the tremor of a man who had built an empire on shadows now dragged into the light. When Ellen took the stand, the room fell silent. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but firm. She did not accuse. She simply recited facts. She named properties purchased under false names, read from financial ledgers showing transfers to Miss Devereux, produced letters in Charles's own handwriting requesting the movement of funds without board oversight. "I do not speak from bitterness," she said, looking directly at the judge, her hands folded in her lap. "I speak because truth, once known, cannot be silenced by fear. I speak because silence was never protection, it was complicity." Charles's attorney objected. The judge overruled. Murmurs rose like wind through the room. The final document she presented was a signed dismissal notice. Edward Hales, issued without cause, dated shortly after he refused to authorize a questionable purchase. "Mr. Hale lost everything because he refused to lie," Ellen said. "I only lost my illusions." A pause followed, long, heavy. Then the judge nodded and declared the proceedings adjourned for the day. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in murmured respect. No ruling had been made, but the court of public opinion, swift and insatiable, had already shifted its gaze. As Ellen stepped outside, applause broke like rain. Not wild, not frenzied, but respectful, measured, earned. She did not acknowledge it. She only walked down the steps, each stride steady, her spine as straight as the columns behind her. Edward waited beneath the magnolia tree outside the courthouse gates. The leaves had begun to stir, green just emerging from their winter sleep. He wore a dark coat, hat in hand, and when she reached him he offered his arm without a word. She took it. They walked through the side street in silence, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve. The city sounds faded behind them. No press, no whispers, only the wind and the soft rustle of new leaves. As they passed beneath the budding branches, Ellen spoke at last. "The judge said they would review the evidence, but I already know the outcome." "So do they," Edward replied. She glanced at him. "You never told me what it felt like. That day they took your name off the records." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Like being erased, but not forgotten, like standing in a room where everyone looks through you. And now?" He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at the path ahead. "Now I feel seen." She didn't speak. She only walked with him, the distance between them filled with something that pulsed without sound. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or something deeper still. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops of the city, the newspapers were already printing a new edition. Beneath the bold letters detailing the courtroom drama, a smaller piece appeared in the lower corner. "Edward Hale vindicated, disgraced engineer cleared in Whitford scandal." It was a small line, easy to miss, but Ellen saw it, and when she returned to her room at the hotel that night, she tore the article from the page and placed it inside her sketchbook. She closed the book gently, her fingers brushing the worn leather cover as if it were skin. Outside, the city glowed with gaslight and ambition, but within, something far quieter and far more powerful had taken root. The train pulled into Grand Central, beneath a pale spring sky. The city stirred with a quiet energy, one not yet fully awake, but humming with expectation. Morning light gilded the stone facades of banks and newspaper buildings, and the sharp clatter of carriage wheels echoed through the wide boulevards like a warning bell. New York had not forgotten Ellen Whitford. As she stepped onto the platform, she wore no veil. Her dress was navy wool, fitted with precise tailoring, adorned with nothing but a brooch in the shape of a magnolia, white enamel on gold, subtle and strong. A wide-brimmed hat cast soft shadows over her cheekbones, and her gloved hands held a satchel containing documents that could rearrange power. She walked with purpose through the station's arched halls, her heels tapping against the tile like punctuation marks, to a sentence only she knew how to finish. The Whitford Consortium had summoned her. The letter had arrived 2 days prior, marked urgent, an emergency board meeting. Charles was absent from the city, in hiding or abroad. No one knew for certain. In his absence, the structure he had ruled with iron and charm had begun to crumble. There were murmurs of mismanagement, of vanishing shares, of unsecured properties threatening the company's credibility. And now, the board needed a scapegoat or a savior. Ellen arrived at the building just before 10 o'clock. The Whitford Company headquarters loomed on Madison Avenue, its stone columns and dark windows casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Once, she had walked through its doors as a guest. Today, she entered as something else entirely. Inside the boardroom, 12 men sat around a long mahogany table. Their expressions varied, some wary, some resigned, one or two openly skeptical. Among them sat Mr. Garvey, calm as ever, his spectacles perched on the edge of his nose, his cane leaning against the table leg. The room fell silent as Ellen entered. She did not sit. She stood at the head of the table and placed her satchel before her, unclasping it with care. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice composed but clear, "you requested my presence. I assume it is because the company stands on unsteady ground, and those accustomed to silence now require answers." No one interrupted. She pulled out the first folder, an organized set of financial statements. "These are the properties my husband acquired through shell corporations using company funds. These," she laid out a second folder, "are the names of individuals paid off to remain quiet about discrepancies in contracts dating back 5 years. And these," the final folder landed softly on the table. It contained the signatures of board members approving these transactions under false pretenses, often unaware of their implications. A murmur traveled around the room. Some shifted in their seats. Others lowered their eyes. "I am not here to offer accusations," she continued, "but I will offer transparency. I have copies of all relevant documents, notarized and stored. If the board wishes to restore public trust, you will need more than damage control. You will need stewardship." "From you?" one of the younger members asked, disbelief poorly masked by arrogance. Ellen turned to him. "I spent 40 years beside the man who built this empire. I listened in rooms you never entered. I answered letters he never opened. I soothed investors after he stormed out of negotiations. And now, I am the only person in this room who has not profited from his deception." "Mr. Garvey cleared his throat. "She speaks the truth." All eyes turned to him. "I have known Mrs. Whitford since her earliest days in society," he said, his tone low but resolute. "She was never idle. She was merely unseen. And those who choose not to see often mistake silence for ignorance. I no longer make that mistake." There was a pause, a deep collective breath. "Then what do you propose?" another member asked. "I propose," Ellen said, "that I be given a vote on this board, with full access to company records and oversight on all public statements until the current crisis is stabilized." "Unprecedented," someone muttered. "Necessary," she replied. The vote passed. Not unanimously, but decisively. Ellen sat finally, her back straight, her eyes forward. She did not smile. She did not gloat. But within, something shifted, a subtle click, like a lock being released from the inside. That afternoon, as she left the building, reporters waited outside. "Mrs. Whitford, is it true you've taken control of the board? Are you the new face of the company? Do you still believe your husband is innocent?" She paused only once, then turned to them. "I believe in the truth," she said, "and in what comes after it." The next morning, the headline read, "The Iron Grace of Newport. Ellen Whitford reclaims her name." She returned to her hotel under a sky streaked with lavender. The city felt different, lighter, or perhaps she had changed, and everything else remained the same. A note awaited her at the front desk, no sender listed, the handwriting familiar. "Mother, I am in the garden." Ellen found her daughter beneath the trellis of the private courtyard, the magnolias just beginning to bloom. Margaret wore a simple dress, her gloves clutched in one hand. Her face was drawn, not with age, but with grief finally acknowledged. They faced one another for a long moment before either spoke. "I should have come sooner," Margaret said. Ellen stepped forward. "You came. I didn't know how to understand you before," her daughter confessed. I always thought your silence was weakness. It was survival, Ellen said gently, but I don't blame you for not knowing. You weren't meant to see. I see now, Margaret whispered. I see everything, and I'm sorry. Ellen reached out, took her daughter's hand, and held it tightly. I'm not angry, she said. I'm only glad you came back. They sat together as the magnolia buds trembled in the soft breeze. Not all wounds required words. Some were closed simply by presence, by the warmth of a hand not withdrawn. That night, alone in her room, Ellen lit a candle and opened her journal. Her pen moved slowly at first, then steadily. She wrote not of Charles, nor of scandal, nor even of victory. She wrote of standing tall in a room full of men, of being heard, of the click of a lock inside her chest. She wrote, I have no master now, no name but my own, and for the first time, the world does not frighten me. It waits. Outside, the city flickered with light and possibility, and somewhere beneath its glowing canopy, the woman they once called ornamental had become unmovable stone, not loud, not sharp, but enduring. The city of New York awakened that morning with a polished veneer of optimism. Brass bands rehearsed on the edge of Union Square. Bouquets of red carnations were arranged in silver vases at the station entrance, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh varnish and fresh ambition. It was a day of spectacle, designed carefully, timed precisely, a final bid for relevance orchestrated by a man who once held power like a scepter and now clutched it like a lifeline. Charles Whitford had returned to the public eye. The invitation had been grand, a railway inauguration, promising the unveiling of a new station and a future-facing rail route stretching beyond the Hudson. The press had accepted with enthusiasm. Political figures, wary but intrigued, agreed to appear. Charles's name, tarnished but still heavy, had been whispered in drawing rooms and cigar clubs for weeks, and now, here he was again, dressed in his best black coat, his greying hair oiled and combed, his smile sharp enough to cut silk. He had planned every moment, the brass band, the ribbon cutting, the photographers ready to capture a carefully staged redemption. What he had not planned was Ellen. She arrived without fanfare. No entourage, no announcement. She wore a suit of deep forest green, severe in silhouette, with a black hat tilted low and a pearl at her throat, not for decoration, but like armor. At her side, Edward Hale walked in silence, his gaze fixed, his presence solid as ever. They moved through the crowd unnoticed at first. The gathered guests were too focused on the grand pavilion Charles had erected beside the tracks, its white fabric gleaming like a false promise beneath the mid-morning sun. Reporters clutched their notebooks. The mayor stood stiffly near the podium, and Charles, elevated above them all on a small platform, basked in their anticipation. His voice rang out across the plaza, smooth, controlled. He thanked benefactors, spoke of progress, cast veiled jabs at past turbulence. He gestured toward the horizon with theatrical ease, as though the future lay just beyond the iron rails. And then he paused, because he saw her. Ellen stood at the edge of the pavilion, a single envelope in her hand, her eyes meeting his, with a calm so complete it unsettled every part of him that still needed to control the room. Mrs. Whitford, a reporter whispered nearby. Is that her? Ellen stepped forward. The air shifted. She moved slowly, with purpose, and the crowd parted for her not because they were told to, but because they sensed that something inevitable had arrived. At the foot of the platform, she stopped. She said nothing at first, only looked up at her former husband, the man who had built empires with charm and deception, now standing in borrowed light. This station, she said, her voice clear and unshaken, was not built on stone. It was built on names that do not exist, accounts that vanish, debts hidden beneath music and ribbon. Murmurs rose, cameras clicked. Charles took a step back. Ellen handed the envelope to the mayor. Inside, you'll find notarized documents, wire transfers, property deeds, false signatures, all traced to holdings that were never approved by this board, only by this man. Charles's face reddened. "She lies," he said hoarsely, but his voice cracked at the edge. The mayor opened the envelope, his brow furrowed. Around him, murmurs gave way to disbelief, to realization, to the slow, inevitable collapse of a carefully rehearsed lie. A journalist pushed forward, already scribbling. Another lifted a camera. Flashbulbs exploded in quick succession. The soprano, Viola Devereaux, stood near the rear of the pavilion, her face ashen. She had dressed for victory, draped in sapphire and lace, but now her expression curdled in horror. Without a word, she turned and vanished through the crowd, the train she had expected to christen now the vehicle of her own exile. Charles stood motionless, his mouth half open, one hand still clutching the ceremonial scissors. He looked not like a magnate, but like a man aging all at once. Ellen did not look at him again. She stepped back, her task complete. But as she turned, the crowd shifted, not away from her, but toward her. Their gaze followed her with something more powerful than pity, more enduring than scandal: respect. The applause began quietly. One person, then another, and soon a wave of sound rolled across the plaza, not thunderous but deliberate, as if they too were acknowledging not what she had endured, but what she had become. She did not bow. She did not wave. She simply walked through the corridor of rising approval, her name no longer spoken as Charles's wife, but as Ellen Whitford, alone, untethered, whole. That afternoon, as the city reeled from the revelations, a new piece ran in the Evening Tribune. Its headline was not bold. It did not shout, but it lingered. The Queen without a throne, and why she never needed one. The article was unsigned, but Ellen knew the voice. It spoke of grace under scrutiny, of strength wrapped in silence. It spoke of a woman who had outlived the kingdom that once confined her, who had stood when others fled, who had become, in the eyes of the city, something far rarer than tragic: free. That night she returned to her hotel, the corridors hushed with speculation. In her suite, the curtains were drawn open, revealing the skyline etched in gold and smoke. The fire crackled softly, the room warm with the scent of cedar. Ellen stood before the mirror. She removed her gloves, one finger at a time. Then her hat, her coat. She looked at her reflection, not as a stranger, not as a ghost, but as a woman who had walked through the fire and had not burned. A woman with no master, no mask, no apology. And as she extinguished the lamp, the city pulsed beneath her window, not as a threat, but as a challenge, one she no longer feared to meet. Spring settled into Newport like a secret finally spoken. The cold had loosened its grip on the coast, and the Atlantic no longer groaned with winter's weight. Each morning the wind carried the scent of new grass and salt, and the garden at Whitford House awakened leaf by leaf, bloom by bloom, as if stirred by the footsteps of its mistress. Ellen moved among the magnolia trees at dawn, her boots sinking softly into damp earth, her gloved fingertips brushing petals still kissed by dew. The trees had blossomed in full, wide, blushing cups of ivory and pink, their fragrance subtle and sweet. She had not planted them, but she had pruned them with her own hands, year after year. In the quiet of that garden, where roots reached deep and unspoken things grew wild, she felt closer to herself than she ever had beneath chandeliers or beside men with polished smiles. A wicker basket hung from her arm, filled with letters, pages sent from places she had never seen, some from distant towns, others from cities she knew only by name. They came in all scripts, hurried, looping, precise. From women who had watched the trial, women who had read the articles, women who had heard whispers and turned them into courage. They wrote of marriages they questioned, of voices they had stilled, of secrets they no longer wished to keep. One letter, written on linen stationery with a red wax seal, had come from Charleston. It read, "You did not scream, but we heard you anyway, and because of that, I will no longer lower my eyes in my own home. Ellen folded each letter carefully, storing them in a rosewood box she kept beside her writing desk. She responded to many of them, her replies brief but thoughtful, her words chosen with the same care she once used to choose silence. They did not seek advice, they sought to be seen, and she saw them. On one particular morning, as she clipped a branch of magnolia and held it to the sunlight, a familiar voice rose from behind her. "You always tended these yourself." Ellen turned slowly. Margaret stood near the garden gate, dressed in pale grey, her hat in her hands, her dark hair pinned back with the effortlessness of a woman who no longer felt the need to impress. At her side, 2 children, her grandchildren, watched in hesitant stillness. "I didn't want anyone else touching them," Ellen said. She approached them, placing the blossom gently in the crook of her arm. "I suppose I felt they understood quiet better than most." Margaret smiled faintly. "They're beautiful. They were once neglected," Ellen said, "much like this house, but they came back." The children stepped forward then, a boy and a girl, both with curious eyes, cautious manners. Ellen knelt beside them and handed them each a magnolia bloom. They took them like treasures. That afternoon, they stayed for tea. Margaret's laugh, rare, genuine, rose into the rafters of the parlour as her daughter clumsily sipped from a porcelain cup too delicate for small hands. Ellen watched them, a warmth blooming in her chest that had nothing to do with sunlight. And later, as Margaret stood by the fireplace, her voice lowered, "I should have written sooner." "You did," Ellen replied, "when you were ready." Margaret looked at her then, eyes shining. "When you stood in that courtroom, I saw a woman I had never known. But I think I always wanted to be her." Ellen touched her daughter's cheek gently. "Be better, be stronger, break earlier, but never believe you were too late." That evening, after they departed, Ellen returned to her garden. The air had cooled. A silver mist had begun to rise from the grass, softening the outlines of the world. She carried her shawl over her shoulders and walked the stone path slowly, stopping to collect fallen petals. She paused at the bench beneath the tallest magnolia, the one whose branches stretched wide like arms, long ready to embrace. There, folded and placed with care, was an envelope. She opened it. A letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Dearest mother, if apology can be measured in words, mine will not suffice. You were right, not because you needed to be, but because you had the strength to be when it cost you everything. I was proud of my name, but I never asked who made it worthy. Thank you for carrying it when no one else would. Your son, Thomas." Ellen sat on the bench and let the weight of his words sink in. The wind shifted, and then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, familiar. She did not turn. She knew. Edward's presence filled the space behind her like a shadow that brought light instead of dimming it. He stopped a few paces away, his hat in hand, the same coat he had worn that first afternoon in the garden, dusted with sea salt and time. She looked up only when he spoke. "I have nothing to offer but time and truth." Her eyes searched his face. The lines there had deepened. The grey at his temples had grown. But his gaze, steady, open, held no pretense, no longing for what could have been, only what still might. Ellen rose slowly. "Then stay." He stepped closer, not to embrace her, not to claim anything, but to stand beside her, rooted, enduring. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was shared. They walked the garden path together, not speaking, not needing to. The magnolias above them swayed gently in the dusk, their blooms catching the fading light like lanterns guiding the way home. Later, as twilight deepened and the last blush of sun dipped behind the trees, Ellen stood on the balcony overlooking the sea. The horizon was painted in shades of pearl and violet, the air still and scented. She turned to Edward, who stood behind her, his hands clasped behind his back, not pressing forward, simply there. "She was seen in Paris," Ellen said softly. He tilted his head. "Viola Devereux, alone. performing in salons. No Whitford diamonds, no headlines. Edward said nothing. She was never the enemy, Ellen continued. Just another woman trying to survive. He nodded. And you? She asked. His voice was quiet. Trying to live. Their eyes met, and for the first time there was no hesitation, no echo of grief, no ghost of the past. Only breath, stillness, peace. Ellen turned back to the sea. Behind her, the magnolias bloomed. Ahead, the ocean waited. And within her, at last, everything had begun to settle. The Whitford estate on Fifth Avenue had once been a stage for illusions. Its ballroom had echoed with the clinking of glasses and the rustle of satin gowns. Its chandeliers had cast a golden glow over lies polished to brilliance, and every room had whispered of wealth, of grandeur, of control. But that evening it was something else entirely. No footman lined the entrance. No orchestra played beneath painted ceilings. There were no velvet invitations sent. No reporters loitering outside. The front door stood open to the soft spring air, and a single lantern flickered on the terrace, its flame swaying gently in the breeze. Ellen Whitford had reopened her home, not to dazzle, but to welcome. The dining room, once cavernous and cold with its long table and stiff-backed chairs, now radiated warmth. The massive oak table had been set simply without opulence, linen napkins folded with care, silverware polished by Ellen herself, and low arrangements of freshly cut magnolias blooming in glass bowls. No footman served, no names were announced. The meal was modest and shared. Ellen sat at the head, not as the lady of the house, but as its centre, calm, composed, and present. At her left, Edward Hale reclined slightly in his chair, a glass of wine cradled between his weathered fingers. He said little, but his nearness spoke louder than words. At her right, Margaret leaned forward in conversation with Thomas, their voices low, their laughter unguarded. Across the table, the children passed bread with the shy eagerness of those still learning the rituals of grown-up rooms, the clatter of dishes, the scent of roasted vegetables, the hum of voices. These were the only music of the night. Ellen watched it all with quiet reverence. She no longer sought to impress. She had no audience to please. What she had now was infinitely more precious. Presence. Every person at that table sat by choice, not obligation. No one performed. When the meal was finished, they moved to the parlour. The fire had been lit low, casting soft shadows across the walls, and there, above the mantel, hung a new painting, Ellen's painting. Not one of grandeur or landscape, but of the magnolias in her Newport garden, sunlight filtering through their open blooms, captured in strokes both tender and bold. It was not flawless, but it was hers, a creation born not from duty, but from truth. Thomas stood before it in silence for a moment, then turned to his mother. "You painted this?" "I did," she answered simply. He nodded, his eyes betraying something unspoken. "I never knew you painted." There's much you didn't know," she replied, but her voice held no accusation. Margaret crossed to the painting and reached out as if to touch the brushstrokes. "It feels alive." "It was the first thing I saw clearly," Ellen said, "after everything else faded." She moved to the sideboard and poured tea with her own hands. Her gown was a pale shade of blue, soft in fabric, simple in cut. Her hair, no longer pinned in elaborate styles, fell in a smooth twist at the nape of her neck. She wore no jewels, no powder on her face. The only adornment was the glow in her skin, the stillness in her eyes. She handed a cup to Edward, their fingers grazing briefly. It was not a grand gesture, but in that moment it carried the intimacy of trust, hard-earned. The fire crackled, laughter rose again, soft and sincere, and Ellen felt a peace unlike any she had known. It did not dazzle, it did not parade, it simply was. Later, as the evening drew to a close and the guests gathered their coats, Thomas remained behind. He approached her as she extinguished the candles one by one, her hands practiced, steady. "Mother," he began, uncertain. She turned. "I don't know how to say what needs saying." "You already did," she replied gently, placing her hand on his arm. "You came." He lowered his eyes. "I see things now. Things I was never brave enough to see before." She nodded once. "That is enough." They embraced quietly, and when he stepped away, there was no shame left between them. When the house grew still again, and the last door closed behind the final guest, Ellen walked through the halls alone. The silence was no longer hollow. It was full, with memory, with truth, with breath. She ascended the staircase slowly, her hand trailing the banister. The walls, once hung with portraits of generations past, now bore lighter frames. Some had been removed, others rearranged. She no longer clung to the architecture of legacy. She had begun her own. In her bedroom, the fire had been left burning low. The bed was turned down. Her slippers waited near the hearth, but before undressing, she crossed the room to the vanity. The mirror was unadorned, no gold leaf, no ornament, just wood, glass, and reflection. Ellen gazed into it. Her dress shimmered faintly in the firelight. The soft blue reminded her of morning skies in Newport, of hyacinths in spring. Her hair, loose at the temples, framed her face without effort. The lines around her eyes had not faded, but something else had. Grief. She no longer grieved. She no longer hid behind the name Whitford, nor behind silence, nor behind pearls and duty. She was still and whole. She placed her hand lightly on the surface of the mirror, her palm pressed against her own reflection. Then she smiled, not for anyone else, for herself. And in that quiet, in that room, once haunted by expectations and illusions, Ellen claimed what had never truly been given to her, the future, her own, unwritten, undenied. Beyond the window, the city lights shimmered. Somewhere far off, a train passed, a soft hum in the night. But here, in this room, there was only breath and warmth and peace, and the end of lies. Newport, summer of 1898. The magnolias bloomed early that year. Their fragrance drifted through the open windows of the hale Whitford home, mingling with the scent of sea salt and aged paper. The air was warm, thick with memory, yet gentle, like the hands that now turned the pages of a letter on the veranda. Ellen sat in her wicker chair, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, despite the heat. Her hair, streaked with silver, was swept back in the same elegant twist she wore when she painted. Her hands bore the soft ink stains of someone who had not written once, but often and lately, to women she'd never met, who still sent letters from across the country. Some signed only with initials, some with their children's names. Some said, "Thank you." Others simply wrote, "I finally left." She kept everyone. The house around her no longer belonged to ghosts. It was modest by the standards of her past life, but filled with light and laughter. Margaret and her children had spent the spring here before returning to Boston. Thomas came for weekends, quieter now, more open. He still wore suits like his father, but not like armor. He had learned slowly to listen. Inside, the clock ticked gently. Edward's voice floated from the study, reading aloud a letter from a former engineer who had found work again through Ellen's quiet recommendation. His voice remained steady, grounded, like the man himself, always by her side, but never in her shadow. He had not proposed. She had not asked. What they had was not bound by paper or rings, but by time, shared mornings, and the way he reached for her hand before crossing the street every time. Their love had not thundered, it had endured. It had survived not because it had escaped pain, but because it had been born from it, like wildflowers blooming in the ruins. The world outside had shifted too. After Charles Whitford's exile, other names followed in the press, men whose empires had been built on illusion, on silence. The scandal had become a movement. Shareholders demanded transparency, boards elected women. Slowly, society began to open doors it had once nailed shut, not fast, not everywhere. But the cracks had widened, and Ellen had never returned to Fifth Avenue. She had sold the house. The funds went to a fund for widowed seamstresses and daughters of bankrupt merchants, those who bore the weight of other men's decisions. She gave no interviews, no declarations. But every year, a quiet scholarship bore her name. And every year, a girl from nowhere walked into a world that once belonged only to the powerful. As for Charles, rumors still swirled. Some said Argentina, others whispered Paris. A letter had arrived once, unsigned, with a single sentence. "I never understood you." She had not replied. Some debts are better left unsettled. Ellen folded the letter in her lap and turned her gaze toward the garden. The sunlight played across the petals of a new magnolia tree, one she and Edward had planted together that spring. It was still young, its branches slender, its blossoms smaller than the older trees, but it grew strong, rooted in honest soil. She rose slowly, walking barefoot across the porch, letting the warmth of the wood seep into her skin. The wind lifted a strand of her hair as she stepped onto the grass. Edward appeared beside her with 2 cups of tea. He handed her one without speaking. They stood together for a long time, facing the tree, the sea beyond, the horizon that no longer felt distant. Ellen took a sip, then leaned slightly into him. He wrapped his arm around her waist, and she rested her head against his shoulder. After a while, she whispered, "Did you ever think we'd have this?" Edward smiled, his voice a murmur. "I hoped," she nodded. "So did I. I just didn't know it would feel quiet." "Not quiet," he said. "Real." Behind them, the house breathed with life. Inside were her paintings, some sold, most kept, her journals, her letters. Her name, no longer borrowed, no longer hidden. In the soft hush of that summer morning, Ellen closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of magnolias, not for the past, but for what had survived it, for what had finally, truly begun. Some stories leave behind more than just characters and plot. They leave echoes in the heart. Ellen Whitford's journey reminds us that dignity is not something bestowed by society, but something we claim for ourselves. That even after decades of silence, betrayal, and sacrifice, it is never too late to begin again. Never too late to plant new roots, to unearth forgotten dreams, and to love with honesty, first ourselves, and then perhaps someone brave enough to walk beside us without demanding we shrink. If this story touched you, if you saw a part of yourself in Ellen's quiet strength or her fight for truth, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you've read or listened all the way to the end, write the word magnolia, so we know who stayed through every page, every emotion, every bloom. This channel exists to bring you these rich, emotional journeys through time, crafted with care and devotion by a team that believes in the power of storytelling. If you'd like to help us continue creating more unforgettable romances like this one, consider sending a super thanks with whatever amount you feel inspired to give. Every gesture, no matter how small, makes a difference. And if giving isn't possible right now, your support is just as meaningful when you share this story with someone who loves period dramas, or when you recommend our channel to a friend. That's how we grow. One heart, one viewer, one story at a time. There are more tales waiting for you. Stories of women who rise, of love that redeems, and of truths too powerful to stay hidden. I've left some of them in the cards above. Take a moment to explore. Thank you for being here, for feeling, for remembering, and above all, for believing that love, even in its quietest form, can change everything.